Hi, I'm Marion from SoftComply, and I want to tell you a little bit about the compliance of medical devices and how you can become compliant with the different medical device regulations. So we're going to talk about regulations in general and standards that you should use to become compliant. And we are then going to give you a 6-step process to be compliant with focus on how to enter medical device market in the EU, but also in the US, because that is the biggest market out there. We're going to focus on medical device classification because that's going to determine how many requirements are applicable to you and your device. We're going to talk about quality management system, about risk management of medical devices, but also a little bit about AI in medical devices and requirements and regulations around that, including the EU AI Act. All right, but before we start with compliance, I just wanted to tell you that although when a startup in medical device field starts developing the device, usually they are very skilled in clinical matters and technical matters of the device, but not that often do we meet startups that either know about the compliance, what compliance is, or are eager to get there. So we're going to talk about that, and I want to let you know that there is a lot of knowledge out there that you can also benefit from, and a lot of similar devices that you can learn from. Don't hesitate to join different online webinars, conferences, accelerators, and really network when you're there. Get to know what others did and how do you best use their knowledge and experience to help yourself to get your devices on the market. If you have software in your devices, then there are a lot of solutions out there, software solutions out there that would fast track compliance for you. But before you start using them, make sure they work for you. They are not too big, too expensive. They are on the platform that you already use, or at least integrates to that platform. Read about them, try it out. Most solutions today allow you to trial them for free and talk to the other users who are using it, just to make sure that the compliance solution that you choose is beneficial and works for you. So use these possibilities out there. All right, a little bit about regulations. In the medical device world, the company must comply with local laws to sell a product in that specific market. And ultimately, you will be judged against these regulations if your product is safe and performs as expected. And laws are, as we know, written in a quite abstract manner, and therefore we have standards that help in the more detailed way and practical way to comply with these different regulatory requirements. So rather than seeing standards as a burden, use these standards to comply with the different parts of the regulations. When you follow a standard, you are presumed conformant to the regulations, and although no regulation tells you exactly what standard to follow, it is clear that without following a specific standard, you will have to show that whatever process you have built is sufficient and is also meeting the regulatory requirements. So basically, just follow the international standards that have been developed to help you. For example, if you are developing a quality management system for medical devices, which most medical device companies will ultimately have to do, it will be difficult to prove that it is adequate to medical device regulations if you do not follow the 13485 standard. Similarly, when you have risk management of a medical device, best to follow the ISO 14971. Presumption of conformity is something you can get when you're following the standards and you are assessed against that. So laws in the US, you have the Code of Federal Regulations, in particular Title 21 for medical devices. In the EU, it is Medical Device Regulation or in vitro diagnostics medical device regulation based on what type of device you are building. In Canada, it is also the medical device regulation that you need to meet. The regulations are country specific or area specific. They talk about the general principles of safety and performance of medical devices. They go into details about classification, submission process, approvals of medical devices, legal responsibilities and liabilities, but in how to build a device, they very often lack the details. And so that's where standards help. In the US, you have to follow CFR Title 21 subchapter H that talks about medical devices. And in that subchapter, you have part 820 that talks about the content of quality management system. And this is already aligned with 13485. And in the future, officially from next year, you can actually use 13485 also in the US. In the EU, you have medical device regulations for both medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices. They are very demanding, especially from the clinical standpoint, and you will have to follow them with no interpretation left for individual countries. When you build a medical device, make sure to start early with compliance and regulations because, first of all, it takes a long time, but second of all, also contact your notified body early on because they do have quite long lead times to audit. Notified bodies are the different audit bodies in EU countries that assess your technical files and audit the 13485. And make sure that the notified body has experience audits and IVDs. If you're developing IVDs, not all notified bodies actually do IVDs. So make sure that they have the necessary experience. In US, there's a lot of focus on predicate devices for 510 submission. In the US, you also have unannounced inspections by the FDA, which is something all the medical device organizations in the US know. It has now been also implemented in the EU that there can be unannounced audit. In FDA, you have this huge medical device database where you can find predicate devices or similar devices to your EudaMed, an EU level database of all approved medical devices. And one thing in what has changed now that we used to have in Europe medical device regulation called MDD. And when that changed to MDR, the software classification also increased. Most of software tends to be medium to high risk medical device these days. One thing that you need to understand early on is if you are developing a medical device or if you are developing an in vitro diagnostic device. In vitro means that it is for examining a specimen that has been taken from the human body. And there is different regulation for that, which is the in vitro diagnostic device regulation. And the classification is quite similar for MDR and IVDR, if not the same. The classification is very important, like we said before, because the lower the risk, the smaller the set of requirements you need to meet, the higher the risk, the more there is. And the highest risk, the more clinical trial data you need to have for your audits as well. For medical devices, the lowest risk is 1, the highest risk is 3, and the high risk medical devices are normally the invasive, active, long-term devices like implantable pacemakers, for example. For IVDRs, the highest risk devices would be tests for transmissible agents like hepatitis B or HIV. The biggest difference there is that for medical devices, you need to have clinical evaluation rather than clinical performance data. So clinical evaluation defined under the medical device regulation focuses on assessing the clinical safety and performance of your medical device. And this can be done through clinical data. It focuses on clinical outcome of the real world application. In a lot of cases, you can have mostly qualitative data there. For IVDRs, we're talking about clinical performance, and this is defined as assessment of scientific validity, analytical and clinical performance of an IVD device. And it focuses on how good the device is, and it heavily focuses on quantitative statistical data rather than qualitative data, as in the case of MDR. Standards are developed mostly by independent non-governmental organizations such as ISO, IEC, and they cover different aspects and variety of processes, including some very specific to medical devices. Governments around the world have agreed to adopt these standards so companies can follow them and have a presumption of conformity to the regulations. The most important ones for medical devices are 13485, it's for quality management system, and it really helps to follow that to understand what quality management system requirements it needs to meet. Other standards that are important for you is risk management standard for medical devices, the 14971. And when we talk about risk management, which we will talk more about, it's all about safety risk management to make sure that your device, if something fails in it, does not cause any injuries to the humans or users. 62304 is for software development lifecycle in medical devices, and this is either when you have software in the device or software as a medical device. Also 62366 for usability engineering, and if you have medical electrical equipment, you need to follow 6061. And for any kind of symbols to express information supplied for a medical device, you need to follow the ISO 15233. So again, following these standards gives you a presumption of conformity to specific parts of the medical device regulations themselves. Okay, now we're going to look at the 6 steps through which you can become compliant. So first of all, the first thing you need to figure out is if the product that you are developing is a medical device. There are some very specific definitions, and if a product meets these, then it must be treated as a medical device. And if not, it cannot be considered as such. It's quite easy. We will look into what exactly a medical device is and what it's not. Second, what is the intended use of the device? And this is a very specific statement about clinical application and benefits of a device, and it is extremely important to define it very early on in the development, as it is the basis of the following steps. Ask yourself questions such as, what medical conditions is the device supposed to treat? Is there any specific population that it is meant for, or it is in scope for, or any specific population that must be excluded? And are there any cases where this device should not be used? So contraindications. Step 3, what is the class of a device? You need to understand the classification of a device in every market that you want to put it out on. And the intended use is really the key to this classification. You have to identify similar or equivalent devices already on the market to check their classification and approval process, because that's a really good starting place also for you. Next, what type of certifications are needed for the product and the company? And that is also depending on the geographical area in which you want to sell the device. The market, of course, is very important because the different markets have different regulations. And finally, the regulatory path and timeline. When do you want to release a device? How long does it typically take to do that? And when do you need to have all these certifications in place? So this is 6 steps you need to consider when building a device and to put it out on the market. So let's start with step 1. Medical devices are products intended for a medical purpose. In the European Union, they must undergo a conformity assessment to demonstrate they meet the legal requirements to ensure that they are safe and perform as intended. So you have to follow the MDR. Before setting up the necessary documentation, though, for the certification, you should identify your medical product. Is it hardware? Is it software? Is it both? And depending on the jurisdiction of different countries, you have the regulation that you need to follow. What we suggest is that start with writing a short description of your medical device. What is it intended to be used for? It can only be like 2-3 sentences. What kind of medical conditions it is to be used for? Is it for diagnosing, treating, monitoring? And if any of that description meets or is similar to what medical device regulation says about what is a medical device, you will have to comply with the applicable laws of the region where you want to sell the device. If it is not a medical device, you cannot market it as a medical device. You can, of course, comply with the regulation to get doctors to sell your solution, but you have to state that it is not a medical device. In vitro diagnostic device is a subset of a medical device, and it is very often device or an instrument or even software that is used in vitro for the examination of specimens derived from the human body, and the purpose is to provide information on one or more of the following, the physiological or medical conditions of a human. And if it is an in vitro diagnostic device, you will have to follow the IVDR, which is quite similar to the medical device regulation. So medical devices are intended for a medical purpose, and if it meets the definition of medical device, it must be treated as such. So you need to follow the MDR. If you claim it provides some medical benefits, you also have to be able to prove that. If it is not a medical device, you cannot claim it is, but you can, of course, comply with the medical device regulation. So when it comes to software, you can have medical device software, and you can have software as a medical device. SAMD, or software as a medical device, is a subgroup of medical device software. Medical device software is a device that is built solely on software or it is embedded in a hardware, while SAMD, the acronym of which is mostly used in the US, is basically a device that is fully built on software. So the software itself is a medical device without any hardware as part of that. And for medical device software, you will have to follow 62304. Now, step 2, you will have to figure out what is the intended use of the software. And this can be a few sentences again. What are the medical conditions that the device is meant for? Is it used for diagnosing, treating, or monitoring of conditions? It's really important to understand the intended use because that determines the classification itself. And if the classification is defined, then you will know how many requirements are applicable to your device. For example, a scalpel is only a knife until you provide it with an intended purpose statement, like for use in clinical surgical settings. So be sure to include details like what does the device do, where does it do it, what, for example, if it's an IVD, what part of the body or tissue samples are taken from, how is it intended to be used, by who, is it general public, is it used by practitioners only, what are the conditions that the medical device can be used for, and if there's any specific population that should be used on or should be excluded from it. And please be sure to write this intended use as early as possible because that is the definition that determines really the regulatory scope that is applicable for you. The more indications you put there, the greater the risk usually for your device. So more regulatory requirements will apply to you. We suggest startups in medical device world to have a narrow application to begin with, so you can put the medical device on the market faster. And then after the initial release, you can expand indications if need be. So keep it simple at the beginning. Like we said, when you determine the intended use, it determines the evidence required in an audit, basically telling you if your device risk is high or low. The higher the risk, the more documentation, evidence, testing you will need, the more notified body audit details will include. So intended use directly determines the device risk. The device risk determines the classification of the device and the amount of effort required to put the device through an approval process. But we'll get to the classification in a second. Okay, so you have determined if your product is a medical device or an IVD. You have also written the intended use of your device, and the step 3 now is the classification of medical device. Like we said before, the classification determines how many requirements are applicable to your device. So if you have a class 1 device or class A, it's a low risk to the user. And if it's a high risk, the more evidence you have to provide that the device is safe to use. Then, based on the statement, you should be able to go through the Article 2 definitions of the medical device regulation or in vitro diagnostic regulation and verify if your software is a medical device. There are 3 to 4 different types of classes depending on the expected impact to the patient's health. The more risks are involved, the higher the device class. And you can, of course, check out the classification also from the MDR and IVDR. The classification rules are described in Annex 8. Now you can also identify if you will need a specific company certification, such as ISO 13485, although this is not strictly always required everywhere. And for all devices, it is pretty much expected by any regulatory agency today that you have a quality management system. The quality management system is basically to tell that the company can develop a medical device based on 13485. Once you have that, you can then start developing your product and submit that for approval for CE mark or FDA submission, depending on which market you go for. And once the device is on the market, you have to keep the surveillance going. So you can't just say, okay, that's it, I've done it, I'm all good. Post-market surveillance for anything that happens to the device, you have to treat it and potentially use as input for change management in your device to make sure that they're okay. So quality management system is a certification for the organization And product clearance, either CE mark or 510(k) in the US, is all about making sure that your device performs as intended and is safe to use. And it is required for every product or family of products, and also for certain changes that you make in the products. And you will need both of them to get your device on the market, both quality management system and a product clearance. Next step is to figure out which markets you want to go to. Is it EU only, or is it EU and US, or perhaps it is even more? We'll discuss that later on. But in the EU, you first have to find a notified body. And to find the notified body that you want to work with, I would recommend read upon them, talk to them early on, and discuss the similar devices that you are developing and they have already audited. Definitely choose the type of notified body that is the right one for you. When you go to notified body, then check what guidance documents they have. They provide additional materials for companies to guide them. They will check on your processes and documentation, as well as to verify your production steps. If everything works fine and there are no major deviations, you will receive a successful report and your ISO certificates. Normally you get some feedback and you have to do a little bit of adjustments to your quality management system and maybe some for product development. We would encourage you to get in touch with the notified bodies early on, because they are helpful. They can assist you at the beginning and make sure that you have defined everything that you should, like the classification of your device, properly. And of course, the other reason why you should contact them early on is that they tend to be overbooked a lot. It might take months before it's your turn for the audit. Definitely contact them as early as possible. And start building your quality management system early on. A quality management system is, simply put, a collection of different types of documents fulfilling the requirements of if you are a software developer or your device is software, we recommend that quality management system to be electronic. You have a set of documents either in your document management system with approvals, you can do it digitally. From a founder's perspective, setting up a quality management system might feel a little bit overwhelming at first, but in the end, it will help you scale and grow and advance your company. It forces you to think about setting up processes and right structures and rules for your product development, but also for your company in general. Start documenting each of your processes early on with as much transparency and efficiency as possible. Get acquainted to the standards of what are required. So everything you do, try to document early on. That will help you establish a quality management system when it's time to put the documents together. Start writing about how do you rev code, how do you plan integration tests, who is responsible for which part, what is a new feature, how is it validated, where is the validation documented, what risks are associated with the product. The QMS should give an overview of your system, and it is a great guide also for the auditors. All documents that you have in your QMS should be versioned, approved by the quality manager at least, if not more people, and you can publish them in your electronic quality management system. When it comes to quality management system audits, there are 2 audits. And to get the ISO certification, you need to have 2 successful audits. In stage 1 audit, the auditor reviews all your documentation and evaluates if you're ready for a stage 2 audit. Normally it takes 1 day. In stage 2, the implementation and effectiveness of your company's quality management system is evaluated. Specifically, the ability to carry out processes that you have described, to make sure that everybody knows that there are process descriptions and everybody follows those. And these in a small company take 2 to 3 days. But it depends, of course. And almost always you will get some comments about improvements that you can do, but with no major deviations, you will receive a successful audit report and ISO certificates. And the surveillance audit is done every year. The certificate has to be renewed every year. Now that your organization has been certified after a quality management system audit, it is time to get your product also approved. This is where CE marking comes to play. And you have to define the user needs of patients or doctors, identify potential risks associated with the product, and start writing your code or technical documentation. It's best to think about the regulatory requirements for your product before you start building the product. It's not often the case, but it would be the easiest, because taking the step back and retrospectively documenting everything is much, much harder. It's best that if your QMS has been reviewed, that your product development processes have also followed the documented process of the quality management system that you put in place. For CE marking, you will have different documents like the technical file, your quality management system, product development aspects, risk management file, and so on. And of course, clinical evaluation reports if you need to have some. The CE mark, which is the declaration of conformity, is valid for maximum of 5 years, but in practice is reviewed annually together with the quality management surveillance audits. Once you get the CE mark, it doesn't mean that now you're done and in 5 years you can see where you have gone and what version you are now on. You have to, of course, keep up with post-market activities and surveillance. If there is any incidents, change management process should kick in. Now that we have covered the EU medical device market, let's focus quickly also on the US medical device market because it is the biggest market out there, and most European medical device developers would want to reach US market at some point. There are 3 different types of regulatory reviews in US that are made by the FDA, the Food Drug Administration Office. First, there is 510K, and basically it requires proof that there is already a predicate device that is substantially equivalent to your device. And a device is considered substantially equivalent if it has the same intended use and the same technological characteristics as the already marketed device out there. What you must do is that you must compare your device to the predicate device that is on the market and support claims that it is equivalent to what is already marketed. And FDA can then approve the device as substantially equivalent to already existing and approved device, and therefore is placed in the same classification as well. And this is primarily for class 1 and class 2 devices. If it's not substantially equivalent, it automatically becomes class 3 device until you provide a different classification to it. Second review type is pre-market approval, and this is a scientific and regulatory review necessary to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of class 3 devices or devices that were not found substantially equivalent to already existing predicate device out there. And PMA, or the pre-market approval review process, is the most involved process from the FDA's and the manufacturer's point of view, because what FDA needs to do here is to determine if the device is safe and effective to use. Therefore, you need to have scientific evidence that the possible benefits to health outweigh the possible risks of it, and that the device will significantly help the target population. The third review process is the de novo process, and this is for a completely new or novel device that has not been marketed before, but they should be in the low and moderate risk classification. And the FDA here comes in to evaluate the classification that it is low or moderate risk and it is safe and effective to use. The next thing you have to do is to file an application to FDA. And there are 4 types of applications that correspond basically to the review processes that we just looked at, except there's one more that is called the device exemption. So very rare cases where a device is actually exempt of application, and this is humanitarian use device. This means that the device has to benefit a really huge population of patients and has to treat or diagnose a condition that affects at least more than 4,000 people. And there is no other device that is on the market similar to the one that you are using. So you have to also demonstrate that there is no predicate legally approved device on the market, and that there is no other way to bring this device on the market other than the humanitarian use device. But then the 3 next ones, the pre-market notification of 510K, as we discussed before, this is when you have a predicate device. These devices are normally class 1 or 2 devices, and it follows the similar device approval process or pre-market notification process that we have already seen. So you have to prove that your device is similar to already existing and approved device on the market. Next one, the pre-market approval application. This is for the PMAs, and this is for class 3 devices. So there is either no predicate device on the market, or this is a class 3 device. And in the application, you must include data from both non-clinical studies and the clinical studies to make sure that the device is actually efficient and safe to use. And finally, the de novo process for class 1 and 2 devices without any predicate out there. If appropriate, FDA will consult an advisory committee. FDA, after those advisory committee meetings, then decides whether the device is approvable or not, or if there's any additional information that they require or request from you. By law, FDA must publish its decision with all supporting evidence in the Federal Register. Once you have been approved or when your device is already on the market, you will still need to continue monitoring the device performance, and so does FDA. And there are different post-market safety monitoring mechanisms in place for the FDA. First of all, the manufacturer inspections. FDA conducts routine inspections. They can be announced before to the manufacturer, or it can be unannounced. And the FDA basically has the right to shut down a manufacturing facility in the US if the standards of good manufacturing practices are not met in the manufacturing site. Another thing what FDA does really well is reporting different problems. So there are different programs where FDA allows manufacturers or health professionals or even just users, consumers to report problems associated with approved medical devices. First of all, there is MedWatch, that is FDA's adverse event reporting program, a gateway for reporting problems with medical products, drugs, or devices, and learning about new safety information about devices. And anybody can subscribe to MedWatch's safety alerts. The other program is Medical Product Safety Network, abbreviated to MedSun. And this is an adverse events reporting program that monitors the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. FDA has recruited a number of healthcare providers throughout the United States to report any medical device problems that can result in serious injury. And each month, FDA then publishes their MedSun newsletter to give consumers important information about medical device safety. And finally, there is active surveillance under Sentinel initiative, where FDA gathers immediate possible safety issues with any medical devices. And it helps to keep an eye on the safety of approved medical products in real time. Finally, if you are considering putting your device on several territories simultaneously, then you might want to consider Medical Device Single Audit Program, abbreviated to MDSAP. It is not exactly the same as the Notified Body Audit, but it can be done together with a Notified Body Audit, like the ISO 13485 Quality Management System Audit. So if you are going to release your product to different territories, including US, Canada, Japan, Brazil, and Australia, then consider the MDSAP program. For Canada, this is basically a must. If you're doing multi-territory release, then talk to your notified body about MDSAP for sure. Let's talk about risk management in medical devices for a little bit. Risk management is one of the most important processes that proves the safety of a device and that you need to pay attention to, and also the auditor will really carefully look at. In risk management in medical devices, you can follow two standards. One is ISO 14971, and if you have software, you should definitely look at 62304 because that talks about the medical device software risk management. The requirement from 14971 is that you will do hazard analysis. And this is a top-down risk management method of looking at your medical device and identifying any hazards, hazardous situations, sequences of events that can lead to potentially hazardous situations, and harms that these hazards can cause. So hazard itself is a potential source of harm. There is a lot of hazards around us, and that's fine when we use these hazards in a controlled manner. because they will not cause harm then. But in uncontrolled situations or in certain sequences of events, these hazards can lead to potentially hazardous situations and can then harm the users. So you need to do hazard identification first to figure out what can reasonably go wrong in any situation and what these hazardous situations it can result in and what harm could occur to the users or the patients of your medical device. So the hazard is a source of harm that you need to identify. You need to identify the potential sequence of events that could lead to the hazardous situations in which the hazards can be realized. And in every one of those, you have to also determine the potential harm that the patient or user may have. So basically, you have the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm that is used for evaluating the hazard's acceptability or unacceptability. In order to define this acceptable risk, you have to ask yourself whether your patient or the user of the medical device can live with such a risk. And based on that determination, you can draw a risk evaluation matrix or risk prioritization number in which you can easily see the level of acceptability of each risk. And this is done based on the severity and probability of harm of that risk. If the risk is unacceptable, you will have to control that risk. You have to mitigate that risk to an acceptable level. And this is normally done by implementing protective measures that are usually in terms of software and other software requirement you have to link it with. So first of all, you identify the hazards, you describe the situations and the harm that these hazards can cause. If the hazard is on an unacceptable level, you will have to mitigate or control that risk. You have to also put in place verification action or tests that these mitigation actions actually mitigate the risk to acceptable level. And finally, you have to do residual risk assessment. You have to evaluate the risk again and see if you have reached the acceptable level already. And if not, then you have to actually do a description of why the residual risk is okay in this particular case or for every one of the risks. Now, risk management is done usually following checklists or brainstorms, and a lot of times also based on similar devices or products on the market and the feedback that they have gotten. So this is hazard analysis, the must-have risk management method for your medical device. Now, if you have software, it is highly recommended that you also do FMEA, failure mode and effect analysis, and this is something that is a bottom-up look at your software. And every software item that in case of the failure of that software item, the potential harm it can cause to users or patients. So if you have software, it would be wise to also do FMEA on top of the hazard analysis. Okay, let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence in medical devices. First of all, what is AI? FDA as well as EU in the AI Act have defined it pretty similarly to each other, that it's a machine-based system that can, when given input from human for a given set of information that has been provided to it, make predictions, recommendations, or decisions. And in the medical device world, then mostly about the physical environment or the conditions based on the human-defined objectives. So it takes inputs, which can be a lot of different data sets. It makes predictions, and the model is trained. The EU has issued the AI Act, and that covers all different applications of AI, not just medical devices. And it describes AI applications that are forbidden. And there is the focus of the high risk applications, and that has a lot of different requirements for these particular applications. MedTech or medical devices is only a small part of the high risk group of applications that is described in the AI Act. When we look at what US has done, they have a really good guidance, which is now considered a gold standard in terms of documenting evidence required to clear a device that has AI in it. That is called the AI-enabled device software functions, the lifecycle management and marketing submission recommendations. And there are two really important aspects there that the requirements are mostly about. First of all, the data. It's paramount to have clean, unbiased, representative data that the model is trained on. You have to protect that data, and you also have to control your development data. And second, the important aspect is transparency in terms of information that is presented to the user, the explanation of how the AI works, particularly the limits of the AI and the necessary human oversight of the AI, and also in terms of information that you provide for regulatory submission. For FDA, it's very important that you are clear how you have built the model, how you have trained the model, and what do you do in terms of human oversight or interaction. When we talk about EU AI Act, it classifies most medical devices as high-risk applications, and therefore you have the following 5 key requirements: data transparency, data management, validation of your output, monitoring of the performance of the AI, and finally, cybersecurity and resilience measures that you take into account. First of all, what does transparency requirement in the EU AI Act really mean? High-risk AI systems must provide clear information to users about the purpose, limitations, and how decisions are made. FDA also emphasizes explainability to clinicians and patients. Tell what AI is doing. The user must be aware of what the AI can do and its boundaries and autonomy. And of course, it's very important to have this information available about the AI, but also what can humans do in terms of intervention, the possibility for humans to intervene when needed. So the communication has to be clear from the usability point of view. In reviewing your AI, both notified bodies and FDA are looking at how the data was collected. So what data have you used to train the model? Data must come from good sources. It must be high quality data. How did you clean or process the data? Did you remove duplicates? What did you do to the incorrect or irrelevant data or incomplete data for that matter? Where did you make sure that the results are good? Is it based on literature? Is it based on human assessment? What is it based on? How do you annotate them and interpret the data? How do you store the data and version the data sets? The management and independence of the data is important, but also why do you consider that the data sets are good enough for your purpose, for the population that you have targeted, for the device to be used for, and so on. Validation requirements is really important that you have validated the outputs, and in there you have additional 5 things that you need to look at. The configuration management, same as all software, performance validation, that you actually test the performance of the device, that you have a team that includes human interaction, human oversight for the AI. And you can do that in simulating the actual use environment for testing. You have protocols and you have results for the testing, a lot of paperwork that you need to collect and show your auditors. And you need to make sure that you define targets for testing and see how the model performs. It's almost never 100% accurate, but you have to use statistics to make sure that your targets that you have defined are met for the AI. Once you have released your AI-enabled medical device or AI in medical device, you need to monitor how the AI actually is performing in the field. You need to log errors, you need to know how you intervene when results are inaccurate or if it doesn't produce results at all. So you need to be able to go through the change management process. You have to be careful when you add training data sets because you need to evaluate them as you did at the beginning. And in particular, if the data set is automatically updated with the real world data, you need to make sure that the data is reliable. And consider change also outside the AI. People could start using your device or AI for different purposes. And finally, cybersecurity. You have to be proactive. You need to monitor any new vulnerabilities before there is a breach of information. You have to make sure that you can protect your data and your model. And you have to have a process in place for non-adversarial threats. If security breaches take place, what will you do? So you need to have a process in place for that. Consider also unintended modification to training data and the model and how they can affect your AI. Finally, actually, that should be the first thing. Before you consider adding AI features to your medical devices, really consider if this functionality can be done by more classical methods than AI, because artificial intelligence in your device will create a lot of additional regulatory requirements for you that you need to meet. So first of all, ask if your users really need the AI before you start implementing an AI feature in your medical device. And if it can, then follow the 5 steps that we just talked about. Everybody is after AI, and probably the VCs will be really happy if you say that your medical device has AI features in it. But before you implement them, really think if they will provide something additional, beneficial for your target users, and if they really want it. As the last thing I wanted to tell you was a little story about a startup in the European Union that met most of the regulatory requirements in a very short time span. And this is the story that they shared about how a MedTech startup could implement a quality management system according to ISO 13485. Marion Diagnostics is an Austrian MedTech company, a startup utilizing the genetic information of the microbiome and AI to develop medical diagnostic software for doctors. The products utilize technologies such as next-generation sequencing, pipeline architectures, and microservices, and with their lifestyle product, MyBioma, they give every European the possibility to learn more about their gut microbiome and improve their lifestyle and diet. Since 2020, they are the first microbiome company in the world that is certified according to ISO 13485 and 9001. And this is the story that they wanted to share with other medtech startups to avert certain pitfalls in order to focus on the development of their medical devices rather than compliance. When the company started, they had only 2 co-founders working on the product, and the very first thing they did was, before starting to develop the product, was to plan for regulatory compliance. And before we get into the steps building compliant QMS, this is the lessons learned from them. First of all, they recommend to embed quality in the culture of the company from day one. Don't get scared of compliance or regulatory requirements. Start early and really understand what is required. Use your quality management system that you're building to streamline and scale. Do not build it just because it is required. Build it because it actually will help you, and build it to reflect what you're doing. Don't wait to involve regulatory thinking until after development starts. Do it from day one. Have a regulatory compliance strategy in place. And audit readiness should be a routine mindset. You should always be ready for somebody to come in and check what you're doing, and it should reflect in your documentation and in your employees. These are the lessons learned, but we'll get to what they did step by step in building a compliant QMS. First of all, identify your medical device and define the intended purpose of the device. So what they recommend is write a clear intended purpose statement, include what your product does, who is it for, and any medical conditions that it addresses. Refer to Article 2 of the MDR or IVDR to determine if it is a medical device. And then classify your device based on the Annex 8 of the MDR IVDR. The classification affects your QMS scope, the clinical evaluation, and the notified body interaction. They recommend that before setting up all the necessary documents for the certification, you should identify your medical product, either it be hardware, software, or both. And that is important because the jurisdiction in different countries will vary. Step number 2, contact your notified body early on. Establish a relationship with that notified body. Reach out early. They are booked for months. Start discussing your risk class and QMS expectation with them. And a good notified body usually flags preemptively issues that you might have and save you from major setbacks once you're in the audit. Step 3, read the standards to understand what they're really about. Biodiagnostics started with 13485, the standard for quality management systems for medical devices, and the supporting standards that they read was risk management, 14901, software lifecycle processes, 62304, and 27001 for information security. They also consulted with people from Jone Institute in Germany, and they implemented applications from SoftComply that helped automate quality management system, risk management, and information security on the platform that they were already using, Jira and Confluence. They suggest that reading the ISO standards really help them understand the ground rules and requirements, and therefore also to determine what online tools are best suited for them that would be configurable enough for their needs. Step 4, choose and set up your e-commerce system. And what they really emphasize here is to build an actual living quality management system. As an agile medical device or software company, they realized that they didn't want to have what they call a zombie QMS that brings more overhead to the company than it actually eases the processes by having them defined. So they wanted to keep everything, all the documentation in one place and have it where the rest of the organizational documentation was. In their case, they already had implemented Confluence for documentation, and they decided to use an electronic quality management system to integrate also with their sprint management. There are basically two options, as they put it, for e-commerce on the market. First one covers a system that offers a complete e-commerce solution as a golden cage. All tools functionalities work fluently within the system's environment, but at a really high price. The second option includes more a do-it-yourself approach using existing content creation tools and systems and populating your own SOPs and templates. Both options are completely valid and work, but none of those fitted biodiagnostics requirements perfectly. And they were mostly confronted with problems like lack of integration to the tools that they were using. They had bad usability, were either too complex to use or lacked exportability. So they found a third hybrid option that combined best of both of those worlds. They have a tool working efficiently for customization, integration, and endless export possibilities. And they evaluated Atlassian and Microsoft environments and chose to go with Atlassian's Jira and Confluence because they were using it already beforehand. The advantage of that system is that they could use it for quality-related purposes, for handling all processes and documentation within the company in one place. Data integration was really something that helped them. And they built e-commerce with SoftComply apps, SoftComply on top of Confluence, and risk management as an external plugin on Jira with SoftComply Risk Manager Plus. So when you choose tools, make sure they work for you. Step 5, define your quality management system structure. Quality management system is a set of documents with a very specific hierarchy, a brief statement about your organization's purpose and strategic direction called the quality policy. It's a high-level commitment to quality and compliance in the organization. And the main document that describes the QMS is the quality manual, which provides an overview of a quality management system and aligns with chapters of ISO 13485 clauses. Next, you have standard operating procedures, or SOPs for short. These are detailed instructions of key processes like the development process, CAPA process, validation process in your organization, the responsibilities for people, the scope of work, and so on. And templates, they are used to record certain events such as training, change requests, non-conformities, and so on. All documents must be versioned, so it's good to use an electronic document management system integrated on Confluence, such as SoftComply Document Manager. And the documents can then be approved by quality managers and published in Confluence. And then when audit comes, you can export them to PDF as needed. Step 6, prepare for the audit. As far as 13485 goes, you have two audits. You have the stage 1 audit, which is primarily the documentation audit to really understand if you're ready for the implementation audit. And in there, the auditor, the notified body, will look at the completeness of your quality management documents. And then stage 2 is the deep dive implementation audit that normally takes for small teams a few days and focuses on the adherence to procedures. So the procedures that you have written have to actually be followed. There should be an internal audit record, CAPA, management reviews, and so on. Output of the 13485 audit is a certification issued upon correction of any non-conformities. There's always a few improvements that you are given and that you can fix in a given time frame, and after that you will get your ISO certification. Audits happen once a year. you will probably want to also get your product on the market. That's where you continue with CE marking and your medical device development. When you're doing software, also look into 62304 to have the processes compliant, and based on that, define and document your user needs, your risk assessment, your verification and validation plans. Definitely take your time to plan for clinical evaluation or performance studies as required, and put all the technical documentation together for the CE marking. You can then get your product on the medical device market in the EU. That's all. Thank you so much, and best of luck to you.